Hello, and here we are starting our lecture on the brain and nervous system. And I want to start out by saying that mm, it's hard for me to make this particularly interesting, so I'm going to try to make it short. And I want to give you a sense of what I'm looking for you to learn in studying these. I want you to become familiar with the basic understanding of a neuron, the basic regions of the brain. I'm not expecting you to be a neuroscience by the end of this, but if you're like excited by it and want to become a neuroscientist, I would be delighted. But I don't think that this chapter or this lecture is going to turn you into one. Rather, the reason why you should know about this is because studying the brain and understanding the nerves is a really important aspect of studying mental processes and behavior. Um, so this is a sort of physiological aspect of something that is primarily mental or behavioral, right? Which is what we study in psychology. So we're going to get into this and let's begin. Starting right off, when we think about the brain and nervous system, and we think about the brain, we mostly think of nerves and all of that. But there are these things called glial cells, and I was personally surprised when I read that 9 out of 10 brain cells are glial cells. Actually, I'm going to give myself a little bit of a laser pointer. That when I read that 9 out of 10 brain cells are glial cells. So most of your brain are these sort of in-between cells that are mostly there for supporting the neurons and keeping them separate from each other, because as we will see, neurons are functionally electronic or electrochemical. So they're firing, they're not firing, they're firing, they're not firing, and it's important that they're insulated from each other, and that's what these glial cells do. What we see when we look at a neuron, that is the basic building block. That's what we're going to be talking about most of all. Neurons are all about receiving, transmitting, emitting electrochemical signals from the body to the brain, sensory, and from the brain to the body. That would be your, the unconscious signals are still going to the body to regulate your heartbeat, to regulate your digestion. The conscious signals are going from your brain to your body to regulate your hand gestures, etc. That's definitely going to be another goofy picture. Anyway, moving right along, let's see. We're going to talk about the parts of a neuron. And I do want you to know these. It's not like, when are you going to use it in life? I don't know. But these are like the basic building blocks of our experience, of how we even sense the world and how we make any actions in the world. So the neuron, it has these parts. I'm going to go through it twice. First on this slide, then on the next slide. Here we see the dendrites. These guys are ready to accept signals from another neuron. This is the cell body. This is what keeps the whole cell alive. So the basic maintenance of the cell is all done right here. This long part, that's the axon. I like to think of it as kind of a telephone wire or a cable. It's the thing that sends the signal across a distance. These little bulbies are the myelin sheath. Not every neuron is myelinated. Not every neuron has this myelin sheath. What these are insulation. So the more myelinated a neuron, the faster the signal can go. And it's all going this direction. I should go around like this. And the terminal bulbs are what's going to send the signal out of the neuron to the next neuron, which then gets picked up by the next neuron's dendrites. The synapse is the space between one neuron and another, across which a neurotransmitter flows, such that the next neuron knows what and how to fire. So we're going to look at it again. It's just a different drawing of the same thing. Here's the dendrites. Here comes the signal into the dendrites, past the nucleus in the cell body, which just takes care of the cell, across the axon, which may or may not be myelinated to insulate and make a faster signal, through to the axon terminals, or terminal bulbs, sometimes they're called, which will then emit neurotransmitters into the synapse, which is the space between one neuron and another, and boom, there you go. That's the activity of a neuron. Now, what I want you to know is that a nerve is a bundle of neurons. And this particular illustration that I have is just the illustration of one bundle of neurons. This is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is interesting because, as you will, it's one of the few nerves that comes straight out of your brain and all the way through your body. And when you get, I'm going to give you a chance to look at this more, and I give you this link because this nerve is fascinating. This particular nerve is called the vagus nerve. Vagus means wandering in Latin, and this nerve wanders all over your body and touches all sorts of amazing things, and is really related to the sense of whether you feel safe or not. So we're going to see more about these different nervous systems, but I'm just going to give you an overview of how cool this vagus nerve. It's related to preventing inflammation. It helps you to make memories. It helps your breathing. It regulates your heartbeat. It initiates relaxation. It sends messages from your gut to your brain. So when you get the funny feeling like, oh, gee, I don't know about this, that's actually possibly a message sent from your gut feeling to your brain telling you to get the heck out of that situation. Or anyway, it also causes fainting, and it's associated with a new field of medicine called bioelectronics. Basically, they're doing a lot of research where they stimulate the vagus nerve to actually reduce inflammation and many other things. So this is, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please, I encourage you to go and learn more about the vagus nerve. But let's move on to the next idea, which is this. Let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. You remember what neurotransmitters are? They're the things that the terminal bulbs at the end of the axon spit out. They cross the synapse, and then the dendrites on the next nerve pick up the signal from these neurotransmitters. So it's the chemical that communicates between neurons. The terminal bulb emits them, the dendrite receives them. Some neurotransmitters excite the next neuron, and some neurotransmitters inhibit the next neuron. And so what we see, it's very complicated. I'm not expecting you to remember and understand all the various different neurotransmitters, but some of these are very, you may come across them when you're actually understanding mental processes and behavior. And we'll read more about them when we understand states of consciousness and drugs and the way that we treat different mental disorders. You may see some of these come up. But here's some excitatory neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, glutamate. Inhibitory is serotonin. That's often associated with relaxation, and GABA is the most common inhibitory. Now, what happens then is that some substances that are common in our lives interact with our neurotransmitters. So alcohol mimics GABA and inhibits neurons in the brain. So this is literally getting stupid. Your brain neurons are literally getting slowed down and inhibited by alcohol. Can be fun to get stupid, but it's getting stupid nonetheless. Cocaine is another substance that actually blocks the reuptake of dopamine, resulting in a sense of euphoria. Another substance we read about is curare, which blocks the muscles from receiving the muscle activator acetylcholine, and then you end up paralyzed. I think they use that in South America. Like on their darts. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Salvia mimics endorphins, resulting in laughter and hallucinations. We'll read more about these types of hallucinogens later this semester. Some diseases are associated with with the functioning of our nerves and these neurological causes. So, in one, Parkinson's disease, which maybe you know Michael J. Fox, who starred in the Back to the Future movies, he developed Parkinson's disease, and that's a disease of where dopamine there isn't enough dopamine in the basal ganglia that regulates movement so that movement can no longer be controlled among sufferers of Parkinson's disease. Multiple sclerosis is the damage. That's what this is here. It's damage to the myelin sheath. So myelin sheath, which is insulating the axon of a neuron so that the signal can be sent effectively, this gets damaged, and now instead of the protective coating, I guess they all have protective coating unless they're in multiple sclerosis, but anyway, we'll talk more about myelination as we go. But this, when if there's an exposed nerve fiber, you can't control your movements as well. Alzheimer's disease is another neurological problem that happens in the brain. We typically associate it with people forgetting, that they can't remember things. But it's a chemical that attacks brain cells, it's like that we know of as plaques. And it's particularly located in the brain, whereas MS would be more of the body. And even though Parkinson's its effects are all in the brain, you can see it play out in the body. Alzheimer's, you see it play out in the memory primarily. Next one. We're going to talk a little bit about brain scans and the different ways that we actually study the brain and learn them. When you're out and about in your life and you're reading about new findings about how the brain works or new findings about how to treat things, you may come across these different types of procedures that people use to study the brain. An MRI is something you can get an MRI on your whole body. It's actually just magnetic resonance imaging. It passes radio waves through the brain, revealing the inner structure. So the way that the radio waves bounce off the different substances in your body, and in this case your brain, will reveal the structure of the brain. An fMRI does the same thing, but over time, it is then able to identify, like if it happens successively, it's able to identify changes in brain activity. So this is what we would see when we talk about your brain lighting up. Parts of your brain light up when you see a familiar face or when you see a scary animal, right? For example, different parts of the brain light up. And that's how they get, that's called an fMRI. An EEG is a different type of mechanism. You put these sensors all around the brain, and it's basically looking for changes in the electrical voltage. So it's detecting electricity based on these faint signals that come through the scalp. And that's another way of identifying what parts of the brain might be active. This is a little bit different because you don't have to sit in a big machine. You can actually walk around and go shopping. There is some research that has people wear these things out into a store so that a store could better understand people's response to, say, their setup and their layout. You could actually watch whether pleasure centers of the brain are being lit up or whether the negative aspects are being more lit up. The PET is a positron emission tomography, and it detects Less active regions of the brain after a radioactive solution is injected. More or less, so it's sort of brain activity after you sort of inject you drink like a radioactive liquid. It's, as far as we know, it's not going to hurt you. But, and then you can get your, an image of your brain. This is less about like changes and how your brain is responding in the moment, and more a picture of sort of the the active is sort of more of like a longer term picture instead of a momentary picture. And so those are the major types of brain scans. Now let's step back a little bit outside of the brain and look at the nervous system. The nervous system is broken into two parts. There's the central nervous system, which is in turn broken into two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. And here's the peripheral nervous system, which is broken into more than essentially another two parts, the motor neurons and the sensory neurons. Okay, let's just stop for a minute. So the central neurons, brain and spinal cord. Middle. The peripheral nervous system, in some ways, one of the things that characterizes it is it's symmetrical. It goes off on both sides. There's a symmetry to this. In the central nervous system, it's sort of more singular. Now, the first division of the peripheral nervous system is whether or not the nerves are coming from your brain to the rest of your body. If it's sending signals from your brain to the rest of your body, it's part of the motor neurons. If the signals are coming from your body to your brain, it's part of the sensory neurons here. Okay? Now, among the motor neurons, that which is where the brain is sending signals to the body, there are two different systems. There's the somatic nervous system. That you can think of as intentional, right? I intend to move my fingers, right? I intend to move my mouth. So all of this is happening through my somatic nervous system. But meanwhile, I've got all sorts of things going on in my body that's being controlled by my brain that I'm not aware of. This is called the autonomic nervous system. So my heart is beating. I'm breathing. I had some cashews an hour ago, and that's probably still digesting. The blood is pumping. Maybe I have an immune system that's fighting off, hopefully, COVID. Not, I hope I wasn't exposed to COVID-19, but like all of these things are happening in our system. And this system is also broken down into two different systems. And we heard about fight or flight when we studied stress, right? Now we can see it's a part of a whole system called the sympathetic pathway. Watch out here. Sympathetic, I have absolutely no reason why it's called sympathetic or parasympathetic. I just know that I'm often confused by it because in my mind, I think of sympathetic as, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's lovely. But it's actually a little bit reversed here because the parasympathetic is where things are sweet and nice and rest and digest. And the sympathetic is about fight or flight. So there's a little trick. Remember, it's a little bit maybe opposite of what you think. Fight or flight is sympathetic, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. It's what happens when everything is just fine. Me, I'm feeling kind of parasympathetic right now. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not afraid of you, even though you might think I look goofy. I don't think you do. But anyway, so these are the two different nervous systems. We're going to advance and look at them a little bit more closely. I like to think of parasympathetic as calming and sympathetic as arousing. Because your sympathetic may actually become involved if you get interested or if you get excited. You're sympathetic. It's sort of like life is like about moving toward and backing off and moving toward and backing off. And all of that is happening automatically, regardless of your conscious choices. This breakdown, I think, is really interesting because it contrasts how the parasympathetic will constrict your pupils and the sympathetic will dilate your pupils. How when you're calm, you'll have more saliva. When you're aroused, your mouth will dry up. When you're calm, your airways are sort of tight. And when you're aroused, they're relaxed. You have a slower heartbeat when you're calm. When you're aroused, your heartbeat increases. You're ready for action. There's more blood flow. It's easy to digest when you're calm. But when you're in fight or flight, your stomach is inhibited. You don't digest. You can't lend your body's resources to something like that. You might need it to run away or fight. There's differences in what's going on in the gallbladder and the intestines. Your bowel is held nice and tight. You're not going to pee your pants when you're calm, but you might if you're suddenly aroused. And then there's a whole complex interplay between this parasympathetic and the sympathetic in terms of the genitals as well. Well, that's a whole nother story. Talking about brain regions, the truth of the matter is brain regions are tricky. Now, I've been looking at this for some years now, every time I teach this section, and I've just revised it for you because when you talk about brain anatomy, it's so complex. And there's so many different parts, and there's so many different ways to understand it. I just made a choice, and I'm just going to talk to you about it in these breakdowns. These are accurate. Are they the best? Are they the complete? That's not my intention. I just think that I want to give you a sense of the brain such that if you encounter people in the news or on Science Friday or something talking about different brain regions, you're a little bit familiar with it because you can always go deeper into the brain if you're interested. But we're going to talk about the hindbrain and the brain stem. Then we're going to talk about, and this is the limbic system, and then the cerebral cortex, which is basically the outer layer of all of it. So first of all, hindbrain and brainstem. Here you see the medulla and the medulla oblongata. This deals with vital automatic functions such as breathing and heartbeat. Now look here. Then you go up to the pons. Here's some more breathing, movement, waking, sleeping, dreaming. These are all basically automatic functions, not entirely, but largely. Now cerebellum, this actually up from the spinal cord come all of these signals. A lot of them go into the cerebellum because that helps you coordinate your movement, your balance, your perception, your cognition. It's sort of like the entry point. The next part of the brain I want you to realize is there's this this whole inner system, lots of inner systems, but you're going to read about and hear about the limbic system, maybe more than others. This system is largely associated with being the relay station, being a regulatory station, and housing emotional response. So even if you may remember in your cortex, that's, as you'll see, where your thought happens, you may remember something as being emotionally relevant, like that time that guy said hello and you thought you would die because he's so cute and you've been watching him for weeks, right? That you may never forget that. And that may be something that you think about. But the fact of the matter is the emotional response is being processed deep in the inner regions of the brain well before it actually gets registered as a thought. There's an emotional response. So this idea that thought generates emotion is largely challenged by this by understanding of how the brain works, because there can be emotional responses that have nothing to do with conscious thought. So the amygdala is largely, that's here, that's aggression and fear. A lot of research has taken place with it. And another emotional place linked to rewards is this hippocampus. That's where that processes a lot of reward signals. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to let you edit this out in your mind. What I meant to say is the hypothalamus is a lot of the reward center. I totally misspoke, because the hippocampus is informed with memories. Hippocampus, memories. In fact, our textbook will talk about use different ways to remember hippocampus in association with memories. But the hypothalamus is and the amygdala are particularly related to emotions. Now, this thalamus relays information to and from the cerebral cortex, because it thinks information input needs to be, I guess, tagged with some emotional relevance in order for it to have any meaning once it gets there. So that's just a few notes about the limbic system. And now I want to talk about the cerebral cortex. And in many ways, when we talk about the brain, often, this is the part that a lot of us tend to think about, because this is where our thoughts happen. They happen all over the surface of the brain. And one of the reasons why the brain is contorted like you see it is, there's all sorts of folds and such. Let's see if this, everywhere you look, you see there's folds. Part of the reason why it is so convoluted with valleys is it increases the surface area of the brain. If it was just a smooth ball, you wouldn't have as many cells on the surface, on the cortex of the brain. So all of these lumps and contusions is a sort of symbol of how smart we are, or how much, how much thought capacity we can have. So the brain is organized into these different lobes. The cortex, I should say, is organized into these different lobes that basically serve different purposes. And so the frontal lobe is often associated with complex thought and executive function and controlling things and making higher order decisions and speech. So this frontal lobe, that goes here. If we go all the way back to this occipital lobe, and when I do this here, I want you to do this with me. You're going to think it's weird. If your kids are watching or your parents are watching, they may think you're weird, but I want you to do this. I want you to go with me. Frontal lobe, executive function, planning, decisions. Occipital lobe, vision. Temporal lobe, hearing. Now we're going to go like this, and we have two headbands. One headband is the motor cortex. And immediately behind, say motor cortex, say it with me, motor cortex. And immediately behind it is the somatosensory cortex. And here is the parietal lobe. This is where you process bodily sensations. So we're going to go frontal lobe, motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. There you go. Now you'll never forget it. And I'm going to take a minute and just tell you about this somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex. One of the things you can see here, they're right next to each other, right? They're like a headband across the middle of the brain. And And the motor cortex is all about sending signals to your body. And the somatosensory cortex is all about receiving signals from your body. And what you see is you can, if you go down and you like tap little areas of the brain, boop, 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 you can see that this whole thing, the whole image of the whole person is kind of represented on each little aspect of the brain. So you tap here, you're going to get the knee. You tap here on the motor cortex or the sensory cortex, it's different aspects of the face. Now what I want you to do, and this little homunculus is what they call it, is sort of just a visual symbol of what percentage of the cortex is devoted to different parts of the body. So if you look at this, is a huge part of the body is devoted to the face, the mouth, the tongue, swallowing, jaws, gums, teeth, face. So this huge piece of our body, of our body that manages it and senses and manages our brain is devoted to like this much space. And if you and so there it is. Go ahead, look at this. It's fascinating. I want to say a little bit. I think I'm giving you an assignment about frontal lobotomy, possibly. If I don't give it to you as an assignment, here's something interesting to read about. The frontal lobotomy is a thing that they started to do in like the 50s, when they thought that there were people who couldn't control themselves. They just took out a piece of their brain. And so here's a very interesting article about a scandal about how the Kennedys gave one of their daughters who suffered from a mental disability a frontal lobotomy. And that's for you to read, should you be interested. Another thing to realize that is important in terms of brain research is the name Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker who had this tamping iron blown right into his head and out the back of his, sort of like up to the top of his brain. And this link is a video that talks about how that all happened and what it meant to science. You can see how the iron went right through his brain. The weird part about Phineas Gage is he lived. This is a picture of him long after that accident happened. His eye healed over. He basically had a flap of skin covering the top of his head. But one of the interesting things about Phineas Gage is he was never the same. His personality changed. He took to drinking. He was a likable guy before, but he sort of really suffered from a really detrimental personality change after that happened, which makes the study of, which sort of kick-started the study of different regions of the brain being important to different aspects of the person. I want to just give you a little bit about executive function. Executive function is this important part of this frontal lobe. It's used in making decisions, making plans, focusing your attention, assessing risk. And it is underdeveloped in adolescence. We'll read more about that when we get to developmental psychology, but here is this guy. I don't know if you remember at the beginning of COVID-19 and the coronavirus, all of these partiers went down to Florida, and this guy says, if I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me. Later, he went ahead and he published like a heartfelt apology and severely regretted such a callous attitude because he thought about the older people who might get it. But could be an example of, I just want to party and have fun with my friends. That's so much louder in my brain. It hasn't made it to my executive function that I've actually weighed the risk. Another aspect of this whole system is our hormones and our endocrine system. There are a lot of different aspects of the endocrine system, which different glands, like the hypothalamus, that's not a gland, that's a part of your brain, and that controls different aspects of the endocrine system, but what happens is in these different parts of the body, there's a substance called a hormone that gets secreted that actually has an impact on our behavior. For example, we need both neurons, which send signals directly, like me sending you a text, and we need hormones because hormones like flood the system and send a message to many different things at once. So a hormone is more like a loudspeaker, and it's going to tell everybody in the room what the message is. Hormones take longer to take effect, and they also have a longer term impact. So these are you can think of them as two different messaging systems in the body. One is the neuron to neuron text messaging system, and the hormones, which are more like the loudspeaker at a concert. There are sex differences in the brain. This is interesting. I am I find this very interesting. There hasn't been that much, well, what am I trying to say? Let me just tell you a little bit about these sex differences. Men tend to perform better at spatial problems than women. Women tend to perform better at perceptual speed tests than women. Men and women solve problems using different parts of their brain on average. So when they give men a certain problem and women a certain problem, men are more likely to use the right frontal versus the right parietal for women. So what parietal is more of a body sense, frontal is more of like a a thinking sense. Men and women remember emotions using different parts of the brain. Men use the right amygdala, women use the left amygdala. Why? Don't know. Women tend to have more connections between between these brain hemispheres. So we're going to talk about the different hemispheres, but there are these different processings. In women, the connection, the corpus callosum, which is the thick fiber of nerves that connect both hemispheres, is thicker in women than men on average, which could suggest that women maybe synthesize information from different parts of the brain more effectively. Lastly, there are hemispheric specialties. The left brain is associated with verbal, mathematical, analytical, recognizing the self kind of thing. And right brain, nonverbal, spatial, holistic, recognizing others. This research, is a little bit, it's not like you'll never have a nonverbal, spatial, or holistic thought on the left side of your brain. In fact, one of the things that sort of sets this whole research a little bit into the back burner is this idea of plasticity. Like if one part of your brain is damaged, the other part will make up for its deficits. So neuroplasticity, I should end this whole thing with a slide about neuroplasticity because it's something I really want you to think about and remember, which is our nerves can regrow, nerves can be repurposed, nerves can be turned off or brought to life again. Neuroplasticity is really cool and really hopeful because some of us who think that, oh, all we ever have are the brain cells that we were born with or the cells that we were born with, there's like a whole world of neuroplasticity that opens up the possibilities of regrowing nerve function or repurposing one set of nerves to do another task. For example, people without sight use their occipital lobe for non-visual elements. Similarly, people born without hearing use parts of the brain that originally go to hearing for things that are also useful to them, but not hearing. So anyway, that's the hopeful message of all, most hopeful message of all as it relates to nerve and brain is this concept of neuroplasticity. And that's what I have to say about that. Thank you very much.